Hey everyone, in today's video we will talk about different ways to save money in aquascaping. Let's be honest about one thing. This hobby is expensive. If you consider the price of plants, hardscape, different equipments that we use in our aquariums, if you add up the cost, it is an expensive hobby. And that might be the reason we have many people leaving the hobby just because of the cost or the overall cost to run it on long-term basis. So it is quite obvious that we must consider different ways to save certain amount of money so that we can actually sustain in hobby, and we can also encourage others to plunge into this beautiful hobby. So this is based on my own experience and how I save money while doing this hobby for last 14 years. So let's get into it. My first tip would be to save money in hardscape materials. As you know, for a aquascape or for any type of scaping, hardscape materials are absolutely necessary. And this is where you will be spending most of your money. What I normally try to do, I try to visit local garden center or rock gardens where I can find different hardscape like rocks, woods, various wood pieces at quite reasonable price. If you just take a look at this particular collection which I have, all these things I have collected from local garden center, and I paid quite less amount of money for all these items. Few of these branches that you can see, it had been simply gifted to me. I saw them laying down in a corner of the garden center, so I asked them if I can take them, and the owner simply said, yeah, you can go ahead and take them home. Now how exactly I am going to use them in my aquascape, so this is something I'll talk in a different video. So rather than buying hardscape material from pet shop, I'll definitely urge you to take a look at local garden center or rock center. You can also try to collect woods and rocks from nearby streams, ponds, or when you are planning for a hike in nearby woods or jungle. But be very careful about the collection law in your area. In various provinces of Canada and in various states of US, they have very strict collection law in place which restricts anyone from collecting woods and rocks from its natural place. These laws are simply put to ensure we are preserving the nature as it is. So we must respect the law. The second point we will discuss is saving money on substrate. If you are planning for a planted tank or aquascape, then definitely substrate is something which is the most important component, and you will be spending quite an amount of money on purchasing quality substrate. Now if you take a look at my planted tank, this particular planted tank doesn't even have substrate. Now it might surprise you, but it is the fact. Most of my planted tanks are pretty dominated by epiphyte plants like java fern, moss, anubias, and bouquet flandra. That's the reason I don't quite use substrate. If you consider this particular planted tank, it has bare minimum substrate at the front of the tank, which is nothing but some decorative sand. The remaining portion of this tank doesn't even have any substrate. It is completely overgrown with plants. That is the reason it is not visible from the front, that at the back I don't even have any substrate. So it is basically the approach that I am following here. I normally put stress on having more epiphyte plants which doesn't actually need any substrate. For fertilizer, I rely on water column fertilizer, which I might explain in a separate video. So the second point is you can plan your tank in a way so that you don't have to purchase or spend quite an amount of money on substrate. If you intend to go for a substrate, then what you can do, you can opt for play sand, or even you can purchase pool filter sand. The sand that I'm using here is basically a type of pool filter sand, and the amount that I paid for a bag of pool filter sand is nothing in compared to the active substrate or ADA substrate, which are quite common in hobby. My third advice will definitely be on aquarium size. It is quite obvious that if you purchase a big aquarium, then you have to buy or purchase quite an amount of plants to fill it in. In spite you are using pressurized CO2 to boost plant growth, in initial days the volume of plants will actually deter algae growth in your aquarium. So the initial investment on plants is quite crucial for the success of your planted tank hobby. That is the reason if you go small, then the amount you will be spending on purchasing plants will be relatively less in compared to a big tank. Just take a look at this particular 1 foot cube tank. I spent $70 on this particular tank to purchase plants. Most of the plants are again epiphyte, so I don't actually require any expensive substrate to grow them. So this is my third advice to you. If you're starting aquascaping or if you are just new in hobby, then try to start with a small tank. Number 4 advice will be planted tank light. Now this is a bit controversial topic, and what I'm going to articulate might actually trigger some kind of meltdown or controversy, but still I'll definitely like to go ahead and proceed with my own opinion and my take on planted tank light. So if you just take a look at my planted tanks, the plants that I have selected, they are relatively easy growing plants and they don't actually require quite an amount of light. That is the reason I pay quite a less amount of money in my aquarium when it comes to lighting. If you just take a look at this 50-gallon planted tank, it has only 3 Nicra LEDs. So even if you just take a look at these Nicra LEDs, these are designed for 1 foot cube planted tank, and I'm using it on 50-gallon planted tank. Even though the number is 3, but still this amount of light suffices my need. So if you plan your planted tank accordingly, and if you're not keeping any demanding plants which require ton of lights, then definitely you'll be able to save quite an amount of money. In all my planted tanks, I use Nicra LED, which is a full spectrum LED for planted tank. It is definitely not that bright if you compare it with ADA solar RGB or Chihiro's lights, which are pretty bright in my opinion. Again, in Chihiro's or solar RGB, you will have option to control the full spectrum, and you can eventually control the brightness of the light as well and set it accordingly. There are options to ramp up and ramp down the light intensity as well. Those options definitely you will not get in a cheap LED light, but this light suffices my need to grow plants, and that is the reason I will recommend you to stick to a very basic low intensity light and choose your plant wisely when it comes to planted tank. This will definitely save you a ton of money. My 5th advice will be to use CO2 system in your planted tank to boost plants growth. Now, I know when it comes to CO2, everyone wants to avoid it, and I understand their perspective. They don't want to create complexity around the hobby, and I respect that decision. But one thing I must tell you, CO2 is basically the lifeline of planted tank hobby or aquascaping hobby. The reason I'm saying it is simply if you consider this lush growth, you'll never be able to achieve it without CO2, especially pressurized CO2 system. Also, it will not be economic as well. If you want to fill up a 50-gallon planted tank with plants, then you have to spend quite an amount of money on plants. And this is the reason most of the YouTubers who has business or side business, they will advocate not to use CO2 in your planted tank. The reason is CO2 is basically the key of growing healthy plants in your system. So if you are using CO2, you will be able to see the difference. I spent very minimum amount of money on purchasing plants. I use CO2 to grow them in my tank, and that is the reason all my planted tanks look lush, green and healthy. If you are not using CO2, then you have to spend quite an amount of money to purchase plants to fill up your planted tank. And this is where most of the pet shops or the online plant sellers will make money from you. So even though you might be thinking that you have to spend quite an amount of money on purchasing pressurized CO2 system, it is definitely worth if you want to stick to this hobby in long term. Do it yourself CO2 might be another alternative of pressurized CO2 system, but if you want to stick to aquascaping or planted tank hobby, then definitely I'll advise you to invest in a decent pressurized CO2 system. With this advice, I'd like to wrap up my today's video. I hope to see you in next video. I'll definitely be looking forward to receive your feedback and how exactly you save money in your aquascaping ventures. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section. I'll see you in next video. Till then, take care and goodbye.